So in this video, we're going to talk about the mechanisms of glomerulonephritis. And just to be easier, I'm going to say GN for glomerulonephritis, which is essentially inflammation at the level of the glomerulus. And as you probably already know, it results in hematuria, typically some degree of proteinuria, and different degrees of renal insufficiency. Some people have sort of a chronic smoldering type of disease. Some people have a very acute self-limited kind of disease, and some people have like a acute fulminant disease that really destroys kidney function and really impairs things. So very heterogeneous topic, but we're going to cover the main mechanisms for why this even occurs. So we're going to first discuss immune complex mediated GN, and so this is a really important category because so many different diseases are caused by this mechanism. And so essentially what's happening, there's immune complexes that deposit into the glomerulus, and so circulating immune complexes or even in situ generation of immune complexes can develop in the glomerulus. And so as you can see, deposits can form, and so if enough immune complexes are present side by side, they can stimulate the inflammatory response. So when we say immune complex, we mean an antibody and an antigen. In terms of that antigen, it could be a number of different things. It could be exogenous proteins like bacterial or viral antigens. It could be endogenous things like nuclear antigens or things that our body already has. Or it could be some other antibody that's serving as the antigen in this new antibody-antigen complex. And so any combination between the antibody we're producing and one of these things can form an immune complex. So one major mechanism here is the deposition of circulating immune complexes. So these will form in the plasma. And so there's a circulating antigen and then an antibody, and those two will bind. And so if there's excessive production of these circulating complexes and let's say decreased clearance, well, then they can start depositing inside the glomerulus. And so they could deposit in the mesangial area or maybe here in the subendothelial layer. Next, remember that the Fc portion of antibodies are there to attract effector cells of the immune system. So this will include macrophages and neutrophils, right? So cells that have phagocytic or cytotoxic activity, these cells will be recruited to this area and they're going to show up and cause local inflammation. Remember, they're under the impression they're fighting off a microbe, but what they're actually doing is causing inflammation here in the glomerulus, and so this can lead to glomerulonephritis. Also, some antibodies are particularly good at activating complement, and so through the classical pathway, complement can start being deposited into the glomerulus. And so what complement does, it has a couple of different roles, but some complement fragments will attract neutrophils, right? They're chemoattractants, and then other complement fragments actually will lead toward the membrane attack complex, which is directly toxic to cells. And so overall, we're seeing a lot of inflammation and cell death in the glomerulus. Next, another mechanism for immune complex disease could be implantation of antigens into the glomerulus, followed by antibodies binding. And so these immune complexes then, of course, can stimulate the immune response. And finally, one other mechanism for immune complex disease relates to direct antibody binding to the basement membrane. And so this occurs in one main disease, and that's the anti-GBM or anti-glomerular basement membrane disease, where the antibody is binding to the GBM directly. And so the GBM acts as the antigen essentially. Either way, we're at the same final pathway, which is recruitment of inflammatory cells and aggressive inflammation at the level of the glomerulus. So very briefly, some examples of immune complex mediated GNs include lupus nephritis, the infection-associated GNs, something called HIV immune complex kidney disease, IgA nephropathy, cryoglobulonemic GN, and of course the anti-GBM disease I just mentioned. So the next mechanism for GN is due to dysregulation of the alternative complement pathway. So because the alternative complement pathway is this innate system that's sort of always smoldering, just waiting for a chance to activate and start attacking something, it has to have a lot of checks and balances. And so it does. It has a lot of inhibitory proteins and regulatory proteins that keep it under control, because you would only want it to activate on things that are foreign or things that need to be taken care of by the immune system, and you don't want it to activate against normal tissues or cells. Now, in order for dysregulation of this pathway to occur, you need a couple things. So number one, you at least need some sort of environmental insult, and this could come in the form of an infection or ischemia or damage to tissues or endothelial cells. And then either you need an acquired inhibitor, let's say like an autoantibody, to one of these regulatory proteins in the alternative complement pathway, or maybe the patient has genetic mutation that causes some sort of susceptibility and inhibits one of those inhibitors. So maybe the regulation on the alternative complement pathway is somehow blunted or lessened. And so if it starts activating, it's a little more out of control than it otherwise would be. Typically, you need one of the environmental insults. So as you can imagine, if we have this system, this alternative complement pathway that's sort of always smoldering at low levels, just ready to pounce on any sort of damaged tissue or cell, we need to make sure that there are checks and balances on the system, because we don't want it to get out of control and attack normal, healthy tissue. And of course, our bodies do have a number of checks and balances, and these come in the form of regulatory proteins. So you're probably wondering, how do we get dysregulation of the alternative complement pathway? It typically involves a combination of things. Number one, an environmental insult, so some sort of infection or endothelial damage or ischemic damage to tissues, plus either an acquired inhibitor to one of these regulatory proteins or some sort of genetic mutation that causes susceptibility to unregulated activation of the alternative complement pathway. So typically you need the insult plus either an inhibitor or genetic mutation. Basically, the alternative complement pathway is not under regular regulation and control, and what happens now, complement can start depositing in normal tissues, and specifically the glomerulus is at risk. And so when this occurs, next inflammation can occur and the inflammatory cells show up and cause. So some examples include the C3 glomerulopathies, which includes a disease called C3GN and another disease called dense deposit disease. And then also atypical hemolytic uremic syndrome is mediated by dysregulation of the alternative complement pathway, and so it's characterized by the development of a thrombotic microangiopathy, whereby microvasculature thrombi develop, and this can involve the glomerulus. So another important cause of GN is due to neutrophil activation by autoantibodies binding these autoantigens found on neutrophils. So these autoantibodies we call ANCAs, anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic autoantibodies. And so what's happening is that these ANCAs are binding to autoantigens on neutrophils, activating them, and then promoting an immune response. So as you know, neutrophils have cytotoxic properties, and so when these ANCAs react with neutrophils, they become activated, and they can now release these cytotoxic enzymes that can damage tissue. And also, there's probably some alternative complement that gets activated, which further stimulates and feeds forward the immune response. And so it sort of turns into a vicious cycle of attracting more neutrophils and more neutrophil activation at a certain locus. And so some of these diseases can affect different tissues and different organ systems, but the glomerulus tends to be affected by some of these diseases, and it's an important cause of GN. So examples of these diseases include granulomatosis with polyangiitis, microscopic polyangiitis, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis. So GPA, MPA, and EPGA tend to have renal involvement with some other organ system involved. Then there's also the entity that we just call a renal-limited ANCA vasculitis, where only the kidney is involved. So these are the main mechanisms for how GN can develop in the kidney, and next we're going to take a closer look at more specific diseases.